Good afternoon, everybody. This is Bassam Haddad. I am the director of the Middle East and Islamic Studies program here at George Mason University, and I'm very excited to be with you today. Along with us is Professor Basileus Zeno, who is going to treat us to a superb discussion on the making of sects in Syria in the context of the Syrian Uprising. Before we introduce Basil, let me just say that this is part of our programming this spring, which is pretty busy actually. We had a few events already the past few weeks. And in the coming weeks, we have quite a few others as well, including a Search Files podcast on knowledge production and pedagogy regarding Middle East and Islamic studies. We also have a major event, Artists Talk on Geographies of the Future, which is a 10-person panel next Wednesday at 12 p.m. The Search Files podcast is Monday at 1 p.m., this coming Monday. And we also have a number of other events coming up that I will share with you today throughout or after we conclude the conversation. In the meantime, let me pause and thank Basil for joining us. I also would like to thank the Arab Studies Institute, Shar School, Global Affairs, and the Department of History and Art History for co-sponsoring this event, and would like to introduce Basil today. Basil is a friend, is a colleague, and a stalwart researcher on Syria that we all look to for sound analysis and empirical data on Syria. He's speaking today on the making of sects, boundary making, and the sectarianization of the Syrian Uprising, 2011 to 2013. Before I share his bio, I just want to welcome him. Welcome, Basil. Marhaba. Let me unmute you. Sorry, go ahead.
Thank you, Bassam. Thank you for hosting me, and thank you for this invitation. And I always enjoy your talk and conversation with other colleagues.
Looking forward to this. Thank you, Basil, for joining us and giving us your time. Basil, I will share a quick bit about his background and bio. Is Carl Lowenstein Fellow and visiting lecturer in political science at Amherst College. He received his PhD in political science from the University of Massachusetts Amherst in 2021. He also holds a master's degree in political science from Ohio University and a master's degree in classical and Islamic archaeology from Damascus University. Basil is firmly committed to public engagement and applied research. His writing has been published in academic as well as public-facing outlets, including Nations and Nationalism, Digest of Middle East Studies, the Middle East Law and Governance Journal, the Washington Post, and Jadaliyya, as well as Syria Untold. Basilius is a Mesa Global Academy Fellow and part of the LSE research project titled Legitimacy and Citizenship in the Arab World, and has served as a consultant at organizations such as the Carter Center's Conflict Resolution Program, and the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia. He is co-editor of the Syria page at Jadaliyya and is a co-founding member of the project Security in Context, which is a remarkable project. You can check it out at securityincontext.com. Basil, we are very excited about this presentation. The topic of sectarianism is a thorny one, not least because some people assume that it is the answer to all of the problems in the Middle East, especially people who are looking on at the Middle East, assuming that sectarianism is endemic, and try to analyze things through that lens. And others, of course, consider it one of the factors that are important that we should discuss, and I'm sure you will shed light on this question. So I will leave you with the audience and the presentation, and we will resume in about 35 minutes or so. People who would like to ask questions can enter them directly on the Facebook feed, and then we can pose these questions to you in good time. So the floor is yours, and let me know when you want me to add the slideshow. But feel free to
Yeah.
feel free to tell me when you want me to do it.
Yeah, thank you, Bassam. I'm ready actually to share my slides. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, thank you so much. Are they clear, the slides?
Absolutely.
Okay. So the conversation today, and I hope it's the beginning of a conversation. It's about the making of sects, boundary making, and the sectarianization of the Syrian uprising. So I start with these two images that were circulated, like in prominent, like newspaper, like journals, especially in Western countries, with the depiction of faces like that, Islam's 30 years of war, in reference to the European, like quote unquote sectarian war between Catholic and Protestants. And here to their left, you see Sunni versus Shia, and we see that also frequently, like in the discourse of public pundits, sometimes like activists who are pro-regime and activists also who are pro-revolution. We saw that also when in interviews with policymakers like Henry Kissinger, like Obama, like Trump, like all of them used that to describe the events or series of violence that's taking place in Syria, Iraq, or Afghanistan, or Yemen. So also we all became familiar over the last 11 years, and I should emphasize here that in March it marked the 11th anniversary of the Syrian Uprising, which has been overshadowed in the context of the war in Ukraine right now. But to the right, you see here one of the maps that we all became very familiar with, which divides Syria into area of controls and try to gauge into the percentage of sects in certain parts of the country. So to the right, this is from Fabrice Balanche, the comprehensive study of sectarianism based on ethnographic maps, where he basically redraw like fault lines perceived as based on the mobilization of sect. To the left, actually, is from 1935, as far as I remember. It's the French mandate map of religious and ethnic communities in Syria and Lebanon, because Lebanon was part of the Syrian mandate at the same around that time. So we see like recurrence and using themes from history and projecting that again into the present. And in many cases, we saw also weaponization of history by reinterpreting the present and decontextualizing the past. And this is, for instance, this is the Maronite here, and here it stems from the state of the Alawites, and here is the visit of Charles de Gaulle to the Druze, mountain of Druze, like in Sweden. But we should contextualize that, as many scholars like Osama Makdisi, Benjamin White, like emphasize that even categories like minority versus majority didn't exist. So, for instance, the Encyclopedia Britannica from 1911, the 11th edition in particular, didn't have even like an entry for minority. But in the 16th edition, like in 1925, 1929, it had like 11 pages dedicated to minorities. And similarly, the concept of and the term sectarianism didn't have any saliency before the rise of nationalism, colonialism, disintegration of the Ottoman Empire. That doesn't mean like sects in the sociological sense exist, but actually the politicization of these meanings as right-based and grievances is a new phenomena, and historicization of this is very significant and very important, including this historicization of concepts that we use to describe or analyze. So all of us are familiar with the context of the what used to be called as the Arab Spring, which is a wave of Arab uprising starting in Tunisia and then Libya, Egypt, Yemen, Bahrain, and Syria, and other protests like in Jordan and Morocco. But in Syria in particular, we see by the end of 2011 an increasing visibility of the sectarian discourse. I'm not making a claim here that reflect actually the dynamics on the ground. In many cases, that the rhetoric was an exaggeration and articulation of certain kind of power struggle on the ground that didn't necessarily reflect a sectarian dynamic on the ground. So my interest was, and by analyzing that, I witnessed, and just for full closure, that I was in Syria all my life until July 31st, 2012. So I was able to observe many of the dynamics that were unfolding in certain areas, because the Syrian uprising was highly fragmented, and making really a highly generalized argument about everything is problematic and doesn't do justice. So my question is really how the social movement in Syria, or social movements in Syria, came to be dramatically and so drastically transformed, first from a peaceful protest centered around popular demands for political reforms initially, and then to as a national movement calling for revolution for all Syrians, ثورة لأجل كل السوريين, and then to the ongoing bloody conflict and civil war, with an increasing visibility of sectarian and militarized discourses. So that has a sub questions. How did regional policies, especially in the context of the Arab Spring, shape the dominant narratives about the Syrian uprising? And what are the dynamics that facilitated the confluence of bottom-up, which means like local and grassroots level, and top-down, supralocal and elite level sectarian narratives and violence? And as I said, Bassam, this is a very thorny topic, and many scholars wrote about that, many contributed to cover different aspects, but there is, of course, fixation on the rule of authoritarian regimes, include like in Syria, Bahrain, Yemen, in fomenting and instigating this kind of sectarian violence. So that covers like one aspect of these dynamics, but doesn't really give us the complexity of agency and decentral dynamic on the ground. So my argument is actually, I want to push a little bit against that and say like, or complement that in particular. I argue that at a critical juncture, which was the Arab uprisings, there was a kind of alliances that emerged in that context between local and supralocal actors. And there was a struggle over representation and symbolic power that shape and also has been shaped by intra-group dynamics. In this aspect, like I'm referring here to the multiple Syrian opposition in this case, and also strategies of boundary making, including sectarianization, militarization, and all the intra-divisions, as well as a struggle over access to state power on the ground. So following the militarization of the Syrian uprising, which actually started in the summer of 2011, locally and sporadically, the dynamics of internationalization and were intensified, and we started to see new strategies of categorization and identification practices emerge online, but also on the ground. And I want to emphasize again, we are talking here about mirror, like the online discourse didn't necessarily reflect what was going on the ground, and vice versa. Sometimes there was an overlap, but in many cases there wasn't. So I trace in this article, I worked for many years on this article, so I trace how local and supralocal activist reactions to the regime brutal violence and its master narrative culminated in the activation and politicization of the category of sect as a residual sociality. And I will clarify some of these concepts, because I think it's a very important before and this is very predominant, not just in English literature, but also in Arabic literature, where we don't define what sectarianism is. We assume it has a kind of ontological existence and which and negative connotation, but really it's hardly defined. And this is what many scholars like Raymond Heinbusch, Fanar Haddad, Osama Magdisi did really an amazing job in elaborating on this problematic assumption. But in general, sectarianism is understood as a political mobilization of religious differences as a framework for the distribution of rights, privileges, and or violence among certain population. I refrain from using sectarian identity in this article or in my research in general because I refer to identification as a process. It's the appeal and the effect of identification to one's sect, which in the Syrian case means political identification around Alawitness, around Sunniness, around Shianess. And thisness, like nationness, it's an event. It's a relational event that could fail and could succeed. And this way, we de-emphasize and denaturalize the assumption that there's a real entity there, or what Brubaker and Cooper referred to as the groupist terms, which refer to the tendency to analyze, represent, or perceive identity categories as a substantial and real entities in the world. In other sense, we talk about Sunni and Alawite and Ismaili and Greek Orthodox or Maronite as if we are talking about a unitary actor similar to the IR approaches to the state. And they are all acting based on the same assumptions, same fear, same interest. So I found it, and I will move to the method section, and we'll be happy to discuss anything. But I found Raymond Williams' use, and which actually was aptly used by Lisa Wadin's approach, that sect as a residual sociality is more nuanced and actually avoid many of the pitfalls of the major schools. That refers to actually to a phenomena like religion or sect that was implicitly lived, but formed in the past, but implicitly lived, gradually gets activated and becomes politically fraught. So we are more concerned about the conditions that makes sect as a political category more politically salient. So this approach actually de-essentialize identity categories by treating groupness as an event, as I said, and also emphasize the performative character of classificatory and schemes and practical representations, which according to Pierre Bourdieu's helpful analysis may contribute to reproducing what they apparently describe or designate. So when, let's say, scholars are describing this episode of violence is sectarian without analyzing why it's sectarian, based on what factors, based on what perception, what motives, what meaning have been produced and end by that, by assuming an adjective like ethnic or sectarian conflict, we as a scholar conflate between categories of practices and categories of analysis, categories of practices that are used on everyday basis by ordinary people, by activists, by non-activists, by politicians. But category of analysis should pay more attention to the nuances of the dynamic that produce these meanings and how meanings are situated and changing over time. So after that, I will touch a little bit based on my method and methodology, because also I think case selection and the method that we use inform the way how we think about certain dynamic events like genocide, social movement, uprisings, revolutions. All these are dynamic phenomena. So our method depends what we are interested in analyzing here. In my case, I'm interested in examining meaning-making processes, which is in line with interpretivist approach and thick description. So I wanted to analyze and trace the gradual evolution of sectarian language in the context of the Syrian Uprising and the subsequent civil war. So to do so, I built on my extensive field work and observation and notes until August 2012, which were complemented with 27 in-depth interviews with activists who were amongst the first movers, like in Damascus and Daraa and Homs in particular. And then I complement that by reading secondary sources and reference and triangulate like my data to analyze 146 slogans that were circulated by a specific Facebook page that declared itself as the producer of the Friday slogan. And these slogans were amplified like on the ground, but also on Arab channels, especially Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya. So I covered like between the period of March 18 and December 27, March 18, 2011 and December 27, 2013, because I argue this is the formative years which basically set the conditions of the next stage of the conflict. So now moving forward to remind people about the early days of the uprising. So before the official day of the Syrian uprising, there were a series actually of sit-ins and solidarity movement in front of the Libyan embassy in solidarity with the Tunisian revolution, and also on social media. But during the early days, and so this is I will focus here on a few slides, like on how the Syrian regime actually framed early on its master narrative and basically still stick to it. So it was based on the invocation of sects and an analysis of Buthaina Sha'ban, the political advisor of President Assad at the time. This is from March 27, 2011. Actually, she had a very controversial interview where she said, like, what we see today, and she was referring to the Muslim Brotherhood that began the sectarian strife in 1979 in Latakia. So she argued that they killed a Sunni sheikh, and I'm sorry for using this pronunciation. She refers to using explicitly the term sects to refer to what was going on at the time. So we don't use this pronunciation in Syria, and actually it's penalized by the law, because it will weaken the spirit of the nation. And many we got into prison based on this accusation. Even having any deliberation about sectarianism in Syria, historically or in the present, could jeopardize your life. And she argued that they killed an Alawite sheikh and incited the sectarian strife amid the Sunni. And we in Syria, the coexistence, the conviviality, and is our identity, and we will defeat this crisis. So I was following carefully, like news around that time. So she was referring to potentially, without directly referring to that, to two events. First is the rules of rumors and fears in Latakia, where basically people in self-identified Sunni neighborhood and self-identified Alawite neighborhood, like basically heard that the other side is going to attack them. And Dr. Munir Shahood had an excellent testimony based on his direct observation from that time in 2017. And also Sheikh Yusuf Qardawi has, who is a prominent cleric in Qatar, and affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood or a sympathizer with the Muslim Brotherhood, he claimed that the President Assad is captive to his sect, and basically all acts of violence against protesters are stemming from that fact. So he's attributing violence to a kind of essentialized understanding how violence is operating.
Basil, let me interrupt you for a moment. Because I don't see the slides moving. I just want to make sure you're not moving them, or if you are moving them, they're not appearing on screen. So right now we have the New Statesman and the Spectator, which is the original slide.
Oh, really?
Okay, now they are moving. Now you have.
Okay. So you see this now?
Yeah, Syrian Uprising in Context, Regime's Master Narrative.
Okay. Thank you for telling me. So the previous slides were basically what I already said: the argument, the research question, and theoretical concepts. So this is basically a screenshot from the video from that interview, and it's available. It's in two segments, long segments. And later, like 1 week later, the President Assad gave his first controversial comments in the Syrian parliament, where he continued to frame what's going on as basically a conspiracy against Syria and resistance, and emphasized that there are non-Syrian actors who are intervening and spreading fears to the other sect by using SMS messages and social media. So the Syrian regime basically, even before anything was to the level that we saw, like many years later, referred to protesters, emphasized violence as a driving motive behind these protests, with a few who were basically were dope and basically were used by good citizens, who were used by instigators or mundassin. So they refer to use several categories: Salafists, saboteurs, agents of the Muslim Brotherhood, terrorists, infiltrators, and Ar'uri. I will refer to another slides later. But by appealing to the sectarian framing, the Syrian regime sought to both mobilize its supporters against the potential threat of others and to discredit the growing protest movements, as well as demobilize non-sectarian protesters and potential joiners. And to the right, you see actually, this is the first time we started to see on social media, but also in Damascus, like a billboard, like referring to my sect is Syrian, Ta'ifti Suri. And under this umbrella, you see all these categories, which is assuming that a Hobbesian word, like without having this state of Syria under Bashar al-Assad, so its sect will fight each other, and which is a projection of a contradiction within this framework of a secular state that maintaining balance between sects. So after that, can you see my slides, Bassam, just to confirm? The next slide, dynamics of social boundary. Okay, so the second level that I'm analyzing is dynamics of social boundary making, and with this I mean uh, I talk really it was painful to analyze the gradual evaluation of the sectarian discourse. So to emphasize that we can't talk even about a Syrian conflict or a Syrian civil war, as it's dominant in the literature now, when they say the beginning of the civil war is 2011 or the beginning of the Syrian conflict is 2011. Taking this gradual evaluation actually helped us like to contextualize how the rhetoric emerged gradually, and we can it's not a blanket, like we can't impose like one master narrative and claim that this is a static conflict, but it escalated based on very specific conditions and in very specific localities. So I go in my article into details to analyze and describe really specific examples about the manifestation of this rhetoric. But this is my theoretical framework of the dynamic of social boundary making among Syrian activists. So the between February and March 2011, before even the Syrian uprising took place, the rhetoric was fixated on reforming the regime. Actually, slogans reflected local grievances that aren't necessarily reflecting like a cohesive movement. Protests in Banias vis-a-vis protests in Dara had basically local grievances that later actually culminated in more solidarity for and call for change. But between April and May 2011, we started to see revolutionary slogans, and that was contingent on how the regime actually responded to the uprising and to peaceful protesters at the time. But we started to see revolutionary slogans emerging in this context and demanding the toppling of the regime. But I call this as boundary blurring because there were multiple rhetorics at the same time. One that emphasized inclusiveness, universalism, democratic values, liberal values, national unity, and reduced actually the importance of panel, sectarian, and ethnic identification as basically principles of discursive categorization and social organization. In other words, like anyone who was in Syria at the time or followed the Arabic basically rhetoric, there was a politics of denial that lasted for at least 2 years. And that's stemming actually from strategic moves, but also from a genuine belief that this revolution is non-violent, based on the actors' direct involvement and their direct belief in change, in peaceful and gradual change. And then between June and December 2011, we started to see boundary making mechanism where new categorization and identification actually emerged, and that started to fragment the opposition from within. I'm talking here about political opposition, but also activists started to have disagreement. Can we change this regime by using a peaceful protest or a diplomatic solution, or vis-a-vis intervention or militarization, free Syrian army? So we started to see an array of slogans emerging at the same time and competing with each other. So at this stage, we moved from panel sectarian identification to instrumentalization of sectarian identification in certain localities, and specifically in areas like Idlib and Homs. And that was between June and July 2011. And then we moved to another stage between January and February until August 2012, where we started to see direct involvement from supralocal actors and support for selected militant groups. And that started after February 2012, not earlier. So Islamist and jihadist armed groups with overtly sectarian discourse and rhetoric became more visible. And boundary making strategies started to increasingly supplant the boundary blurring about inclusiveness, about democratic values, about liberal change, and started to be withdrawn from the public discussion, and the emphasis was around the how to change and found a quick solution. So the final stage is between January and June 2013, where we see actually transnationalization of militant sectarian identification. And that stage actually marked the direct intervention by Hezbollah and the Iranian Revolutionary Army and their basically clients in the region. So there which made the argument about bipolarization in the region between the Shia and Sunni more as an extension of what was going on in Iraq, and the competition between Iran and Saudi Arabia became more visible, to put it this way. So we started to see sect-coded slogans increasingly reflected the confluence of bottom-up, local and grassroots level, and top-down, supralocal and elite level dynamics. So how that manifested on the ground? So that was the theoretical framework and analysis. So I took the case study as I said, like a specific episode of violence and the rhetorical changes between 2011 and 2012. So one of the major producer, and social media played a major role later in the conflict, and as Mark Lynch argued, that the Syrian conflict is one of the most socially mediated civil war in our contemporary history. So here, social media played a major role in documenting violations, but also amidst many things, eyewitnesses, giving platform that is not censored by the state, but at the same time played a major role in virtual sectarianization of public sphere and politics of categorization and delegitimization of groups that don't see the same path or share the same path of change. So I select this Syrian revolution against Bashar al-Assad 2011, which in the memory of the early generation of the Syrian activists, because we have many generations right now, was very important and significant. It called for a day of rage in February 5th, 2011. This is before the uprising, but it failed because it was mainly launched by anonymous initially administrators who are beside in exile. Later on, we knew that they based in Sweden. But then when the first successful demonstration took place in Souk al-Hamidiyya, they were the ones who basically circulated the video, uploaded the video, and shared it with the media, and they gained visibility immediately. Hamza Mustafa, a Syrian scholar, basically did a great job in documenting the early stages, and we see like an increase. We are talking about limited access to social media for Syrians because it was under censorship, and people and activists used to use ultraserve and Tor just to access the internet. So we see an increase from 42,000 by mid-March to actually 130,000 by April. And by the end of December 2013, almost a million followers followed this Facebook page. So after that, this Facebook page basically gained momentum and produced between 2011 2013 more than 146 Friday slogan. And in May 2011, so I cover in details for anyone who is interested, like my paper cover in details and contextualize how this rhetoric unfolded and what was the dynamics on the ground at the time, and why some slogans were very controversial and didn't reflect really the dynamic of the struggle on the ground and how it was perceived by activists. But as I referred, like back here, like one of the categories that the Syrian regime used to refer to any critics and opponent as Aruri, as a follower of Adnan al-Arur, who had very limited influence in really a few neighborhoods. And Burhan Ghalioun argued in his memoir that he had spent like millions of dollars to basically to sponsor like protests to support his cause. That's Burhan Ghalioun's argument. Definitely, he had some followers, but both the Syrian regime exaggerated his influence on the movement, and he was based in Saudi Arabia, and actually he was mocked by many Syrian activists about his role. But interestingly, anyone who was following, this is from a screenshot from Al Jazeera from September 2011, where they introduced him as the most important and significant peaceful actor in the Syrian uprising. Al Arabiya did the same. Wisal, the Salafist channel, also did the same. And we started to see, at least visibly, he became mirroring both the regime's rhetoric and the Al Jazeera and some of the supralocals' interest on the other hand. So after many controversial and the ambiguous and unclear control over who is producing the Friday slogan, they developed a mechanism, internal mechanism, where you can vote and select the Friday's slogan amongst like 4 or 5 or sometimes 6 options. So I interviewed one of the Syrian Palestinian activists who was a member of the local coordination committee, and actually he reflected on some of the dynamics. He said, like, he made the argument that it's not as what it seems. It was even more complicated how these slogans were, even before reaching the point of voting in the poll, they reflected different interests, where the LCC basically promoted nationalistic, secular, inclusive slogans based on Syrianness, based on a country for all, whereas there was other forms of activists who basically had an interest that were in alliance with supralocal actors' interest, where they invested in more Islamist rhetoric. And he argued that the government of Qatar or certain actors in Qatar invested in this process. I have no way to verify or not. This is just a quote. So he said at least they could afford to spend lots of money to promote their agenda, and there is a tight connection between the Syrian Revolution General Commission and the Syrian Revolution against Bashar al-Assad in 2011, at least in the later stages, not in the beginning. So now moving to how that manifested and how these social media tools were used to produce like a mechanism of boundary making. So this is the shift from an example of the shift from boundary blurring, where coexisted nationalistic and also inclusiveness, but at the same time there are some sectarian discourses here and there. They coexisted without supplanting, but the most emphasis early on was in inclusiveness and a new Syria, basically, that is more democratic, more inclusive. So the Syrian revolution against Bashar al-Assad basically proposed later on like a problematic way of mobilizing their voters, and sometimes counted like fake accounts to increase to win the vote. So they sought to delegitimize other political groups and political actors like the Hayat Tansiq al-Wataniya, the national coordination body, by proposing Friday's slogan on November 11 called the Syrian Hayat Tansiq al-Watani la tumathiluna. The NCP doesn't represent us. That was in addition to another Friday slogan, which is freezing of Syria's Arab League membership. تجميد عضوية سوريا في الجامعة العربية. So we see actually that wasn't just a rhetoric. That wasn't on social media. To the right, you see a protest from Tibat al-Imam, where to the right, you see actually the banners reflecting these slogans that were voted on. And also we see the new Libyan flag and new proposed Syrian flag, because in the early months of the Syrian Uprising, both Syrian activists and pro-regime supporters shared the same official Syrian flag. So that has another story. And another example, like when they voted for proposed like Friday's slogan on October 7, where they said the Syrian National Council represents Syrians. So in other words, we see rhetorical strategies promoted the necessity of supralocal actors, individual, regional, international, as inevitable, moral, and the only alternative, and de-emphasize and or outright attack non-violent alternatives. Here, I'm not arguing which is right and which is wrong, but what I'm arguing is that we started to see intra-conflict over a monopoly over the symbolic representation of the uprising. So a step up towards group making and always like analyzing these slogans is in the light of my conceptual chronological order that I proposed. Here, there was a shift. During the first 2 years of the uprising, at least the first year, there was a complete denial and romanticization of the uprising, that there is no violence, no sectarianism. Any talk about sectarian violence is only fixated on acts that were committed by the Shabiha and the regime's basically thugs and the security forces. Any talk about any documented violations committed by the rising Islamist militant group amidst the armed opposition is basically either denied, edited out. We have also examples and later evidence about editing out, or completely denied, or normalized as it's a this is understood. This is just a reaction. This is what mechanically people became use sectarian violence to respond to other sectarian violence. So this is a screenshot from actually a proposed Friday where hundreds of thousands of Syrians protested under a Friday that's called. I have 5 minutes and I'm done. So on December 12, 2012, we shifted from the denial of the existence of Jabhat al-Nusra to actually protest organized to support Jabhat al-Nusra. And that was called La Irhab illa Irhab al-Assad. There is no terrorism in Syria except that of al-Assad's regime. And that has a context. That context was the designation of Jabhat al-Nusra as a terrorist organization by the United States under Obama, which many activists, and here, this is why it's very complex analysis. We can't rely on really simplifying and finding causal relation in this regard, because many activists didn't necessarily normalize the existence of Nusra, but tried to hypothesize why this is the most powerful. They found it as the most powerful resistant actor against brutality by the security forces on the one hand, and yet there is no accountability, no condemnation, no designation from their perspective of the Syrian forces as a terrorist group, for instance. That was the narrative. So why this group that is resisting the Assad forces is designated as such, but not those who are perpetrating more violence. So that was the context of why this you found even secular and leftist activists actually trying to make the cause that this designation is wrong, and they understood at least why these protests took place. So the final stage is, as I emphasized in my chronology, is the 2013, the early 6 months of the 2013. We started to see explicitly using concepts like minority versus majority, protecting of the majority against the minority, and actually there were systematic campaigns of character assassination, bullying, cyberbullying, accusing of activists who are supporting the revolution, but just because they happen to be from a minority background, that their hesitation to support militarization or support like al-Nusra, it's stemming from having sectarian hidden identity, and they so that was also a dominant narrative in Arabic. But this is one of the most explicit um, um, slogans. And we see here a shift, radical shift from inclusiveness, from a Friday of Salih al-Ali in June 2011 to now talking about Friday of majority protection. This is from April 2013. This is interesting. This is another slogan arguing, making the slogan against the Safavid project, threat to the Al-Ummah, which is perceived as the Islamic Sunni Ummah. And here it says, like on the forehead of Khamenei, Hizb al-Shaytan, referring to Hezbollah. The interesting thing here is not just social media. We have actual protests that were organized against under this banner, but this is from June 14, 2013. So what Al Jazeera did at that time, they ran this controversial poll that you can't find now. It's I documented that during that time. So where they proposed like a polling asking a very binary question, similar to the first images that I show you from the about Shia versus Sunni, the comic ones. It's from June 14, the same day, to June 20, 2013. The question is simply vote who is responsible for transforming the Syrian revolution into Shia-Sunni conflict. Is it the Shia or the Sunni? So this is in line of this proposed social media slogan. Protests were organized on the ground. Al Jazeera ran this. So you see here an amplification and granting more credibility to sectarian or sect-coded messages that doesn't necessarily reflect the aspiration of many activists around that time. And by 2013, many actually lost any interest in the voting, and there was an escalation, and we reached a stage of really conflict and civil war after July 2012, and some argue it's earlier. So finally, as a rule of the supralocal actors, which I use to refer to heterogeneous conglomeration of groups and individuals that refer to Islamist charities, to some governments, to individuals, to sectarian entrepreneur, so who invested and tapped into the conflict and projected their own master narrative about basically bipolarization and conflict between Shia, Majus, Iran against the Sunni, the Ummah, and the persecuted Sunni in the region. So that was the master narrative that spills on what has been accumulated during the war and after the occupation of Iraq. So this is a screenshot actually from Sheikh Hajjaj al-Ajami. He and his brother are very interesting. They are Kuwaiti, Salafist, rich activists, Islamist activists, who donated basically hundreds of thousands, if not millions. And they are the ones who sponsored partially the campaign that was led to sectarian murdering of many Alawite villagers in Latakia. If you remember, that was in retaliation to the sectarian massacre that was committed by the Syrian regime in Banya. So their name was, and that was under the banner of the Free Syrian Army around that time. Here they called for donations, and these donations basically were funneled to more groups on the ground. So we started to see actually early on from 2012, like many groups on the ground changed their name, and the Free Syrian Army was fragmented from the very beginning, but lacked any support, either symbolically or in terms of weapon or in terms of political support. Instead, we started to see groups that emerged and changed their rhetoric, local actors who wanted to tap into this investment from supralocal. And it's unlike the instrumentalist argument, which argued basically that local actors are more like puppets. controlled by supralocal instrument. Their identity is instrumentalized to gain some interest. In many cases, like these local actors or instigators of local violence capitalize on that investment and use that pragmatically. In other words, like sometimes they change the flag, they grow peers, but they weren't really true believer in Islamist radical jihadism, but that was part of the need to protect their, from their perspective, local community. Other were opportunists, other were warlords. So there are many actors that hard to be. It's very hard to claim that they are under one category. So finally, I would say between 2011 and 2013, what I found during my fieldwork, qualitative analysis, interviews, that in line with big data that was conducted by Mark Lynch and others, that we started to see a shift towards donations during the first 8 months of the 2012 that reflect a growing role of regional sectarian entrepreneurs and religious personalities in the Gulf, especially Saudi and Kuwaiti figures. And by 2013, tweets about jihad in Syria grow rapidly in prevalence. Finally, this is just from 2012, an example. To the right, you see before and after. So this is the early rising groups, a part of the Free Syrian Army, how they even changed the revolutionary flag to the sponsor flag. To here the Saudi, here the Salafist flag, from the right to the left. So that's a reflection of these dynamics between local and supralocal actors. And in conclusion, my approach seeks to analyze the dynamics of sectarianization as a process, centering groupness as an analytical category and sects as a residual sociality, which is perceived usually as unitary actors that help us to make discernible the dynamic of intra-conflict amongst various groups vis-a-vis meanings, social powers, public spheres, and subjectivity that are otherwise made invisible by the terms through which the sectarian discourse operates. That these dynamics, I argue, are themselves constitutive of this discourse. So in other words, the increasing visibility of sectarian frameworks and the demobilization of non-sectarian actors were parts of boundary-making strategies pursued by certain actors who sought to have a monopoly over symbolic representation of the uprising and were contingent on the escalation of violence, militarization and internationalization of the uprising, and transnationalization of Syrian networks. So through these strategies of boundary making, the sectarian conflict between putative sects in Syria is produced, imagined as such through processes of reification, sectarianization, and writings which analyze, represent, or perceive identity categories such as sex and ethnicity as substantial and real entities. So thank you so much for for this opportunity to share my research, and I'm looking forward to your question.
Ahlan Basil, this is a really fascinating account of the Syrian uprising and the question of sectarianism as it relates to the Syrian uprising. I am very glad that we had the opportunity to address this, and I can't think of anyone who could do this better than you have so far. So I really appreciate your intervention. At this point, Basil, we might have a couple of questions from audiences, although usually people are a bit timid when the topic is a bit thorny. But I would like to ask or start by asking you some questions or a couple of questions to get things going. Can you tell us a little bit about, before we move forward, about your recent article that appeared in a peer-reviewed journal and kind of like hone in on that before I address my first question?
Yeah, so I'm working on multiple projects as all of us, of course. But most recently, I this one appeared on the anniversary of the Syrian uprising on March 15, like basically a few weeks ago. That was the result of many years and working, and that focused on documenting these early stages of the Arab Spring, and also the sectarianization of the Syrian Uprising in terms of the rhetoric and also some of the dynamics on the ground. And definitely there are lots of amazing literature that contributed to our understanding, but I will comment later on how the lack of fieldwork access culminated in producing like certain narrative or amplifying certain stories. But I also published a few months ago another piece about called Education and Alienation, where I analyzed the impact of the Syrian conflict and changing school curriculum in the context of the Syrian uprising as an part of the ideological apparatus in terms of defining who belongs to the state and who is outsider. And some of the examples, the Syrian government changed the content of the school curriculum, and that the Kurdish controlled area we have another school curriculum, and that the opposition we have another one, and under ISIS we have another one that was similar to the one that was used by the Americans when they supported the Taliban in the 1980s and 1990s, and found that very, very interesting, where early veteran basically who learned about the significance of education in Afghanistan amongst children to fight against the Soviet, that this is the best way to indoctrinate them. And then I draw on interviews that I conducted with some families inside Syria, and I complement that with another case study in San Diego in California, where I found really problematic approaches to integrating displaced Syrian refugees into the American school system without taking into consideration the effect of conflict and trauma on them. So also I worked on, recently we published a comprehensive report about this is in cooperation with ACLU Maine and ALEP, which is a lab that is supporting refugees, where we analyzed like lives in limbo, the effect of weaponization of bureaucracy in the United States against asylum seekers from certain countries, and we found like there is a discrimination against and denying of asylum cases for applicants from certain countries like the Middle East and Africa.
Thanks, Basil, for this. I really appreciate it. I have a basic question about your approach and methodology. As you know, there's so much that's been written on sectarianism. Much of it essentializes sect and attributes to it all sorts of things that we cannot or people seem to not be able to find a cause for. So it becomes just like political culture. It becomes the black box, the explanatory black box that you basically try to explain everything through it. But tell us a little bit about you focus on the first couple of years of the uprising, and you also focus on strategies of group making. Can you tell us a little bit why you've adopted this approach, and how have I know that you have a lot of experiences and you've had quite a bit of a journey. We're not going to get into that because that can be a lecture on its own.
Yeah.
How do these experiences inform your research?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's important to reflect on my own positionality as because the usual story of scholars doing research is basically scholars who are based in the global north, like the United States, Canada, and Europe, who go to the global south context and conduct field work and go back to analyze their data in global north institute. So basically, and also uh, the stakeholder for them is minimal in comparison with local scholars, like also my like any scholars, social scientists like in the region who are still in the region can't do the same research that we can do actually after we left the country, or those who already American or Canadian. And why I'm saying that, like, because during the early years of the uprising, I have like a historical sensitivity because I'm an archaeologist by training. So I was observing history unfolding, but didn't have any conceptual tools that would help me make sense of what's going on. So what I did is basically documenting my observation, writing notes, documenting photos and images and slogans, in the hope that one day I can use them or write about them. But once I moved to the United States, I couldn't come back to Syria, so I applied for political science and started a new journey where I was able to be trained and make use of my method and theories and how to make sense of the data that I collected. So why I'm giving you this background? Because one of the aspects that we see dominant is that what you refer to, like there is the use of sectarianism and sects in general as explanatory concepts by themselves, like attributing any kind of violence to sectarian because the regime is perceived as an Alawite and the protesters are perceived are represented as Sunni. In Iraq, it's the other way. In Bahrain, it's the other way, and so on and so forth. But what I wanted to shed light on is when you rely on the analyzing rhetorics and mining data that is already available here, or relying on testimonies by activists only, so basically you are producing very specific narrative. I'm not saying this is right or wrong, but I'm saying it's one story of many complicated and competing stories that coexisted and culminated in the emergence of certain stories to the surface as the most prominent and the morally right one at the expense of others. And we have to acknowledge that the one of the misfortune of the Syrian uprising and in general, that this decentralized, lack of cohesive organization in terms of parties or even military organization, or in terms of coordination between activists. So you have all these fragmentation that basically exploded. And the main reason, of course, that uh, access to public sphere and discussion was basically prohibited by the Syrian regime for 50 years. This is one of many reasons. So what I wanted to emphasize is by analyzing processes of group making, group learning, and these mechanisms and how they unfolded, and how actually some activists who were secular, 100% secular, use sectarian discourse that doesn't reflect they were sectarian like necessarily, but they were responding to certain narrative and certain episodes of violence that they used the only framework that was available to them based on the amplification of social media, protest, and also mass media. So when you have these vocabularies all over the place, you reuse them and articulate your concerns and grievances based as such, and you demonstrate solidarity based on that. So we saw, for instance, um, the late actually Fadwa Suleiman, who died, like one of the most heroic figure. Like she had a complete. She only defined herself as Syrian only, but there were some of her colleague and friends emphasize the Alawiness of her background to refer that, oh, she is an Alawite and support the Syrian revolution. So this is not a sectarian uprising, because we have Alawite, we have Sunni, we have all this. So that's problematic, because that reify and reproduce the image of sect as based on the individual as the only way of mobilization and being in solidarity with each other. That actually made the saliency of a class, for instance, less significant and less important, even though it was more important in many places and many locales in Syria.
Thanks, Basil. We have a few questions from Facebook. The first question was by somebody called Frank, who was advocating a more formal approach to your lecture. So if you want, I can give you his credentials and email or a
Yeah, sure.
Facebook handle. So I'm just joking. So you can ask him how to deliver a lecture better. He suggests a more formal approach, and not to be. I completely find this unnecessary, but out of interest in transparency, I'm sharing it. Another actual question by Ali Al Jundi. They write, could you tell us about the context on the ground that helped form the sectarian narrative that you're addressing? He stopped at narrative, and I'm assuming the one that you're addressing. And then we have another question by Katie Misha, which I will read. Thanks for a great talk. From your observation, how did sectarianism play? What role did sectarianism play in the context of post 2011 Syria, in comparison to neighboring countries like Iraq and Lebanon? Which is a great question. Of course, we have limited time. We have another 15 to 20 minutes, but maybe you can just shed some light on this because it's important. And then there is another question by Muhammad. It says, what did ISIS entry into the scene do for the development of sectarianism in Syria? Did it push opposition groups to tone down their sectarianism, or did it provide an incentive to be even more competitive with sectarianism? So I'll give you these three questions, and then if we have time for another round, we'll do one. Otherwise, this is a handful.
Yeah, this is okay. So first, I respond. I didn't understand what's formal and informal lectures.
ولا me neither. I think
fine.
I think maybe your conclusions about how to be very careful with the question of sect, and it's not the end all and be all, might not have squared with some audiences who look at sect as the singular most significant explanatory variable, and it's not.
Yeah, and this is definitely one way of making this argument, right? This is why we have different schools, different approaches, and that started from 1990s onwards. Like, so it's not a new phenomenon.
Precisely. And when you knew, and the reason I'm saying this is when I address the question of sectarianism in the region, as well as the question of sectarianism in Syria, because it doesn't fit with a certain template that attribute so much explanatory power to sectarianism, it's just not satisfying to hear. When we nuance sectarianism beyond some people's sort of tastes, intellectual or analytical tastes, it just sounds unnecessarily complex. Whereas in reality, it's the more simplified and reductionist approaches that are not useful. But please, if you can take on the question of developments on the ground and the other ones that I mentioned.
So thank you, Ali, for your question. So the dynamic varied locally. And let's say you are analyzing the content of slogans and media or rhetorics that are available online or big data. Like you are dealing with the finished product. You don't deal with the power behind constructing certain narratives, like the intra-conflict between different groups and how that culminated in the emergence of certain narratives. Like I can give you like two specific examples. One, there was one specific problematic Friday called the Friday of Grandchildren of Khalid bin al-Walid in Homs, and the vote around that time was in favor by the LCC, the secular one, is in national unity. So when you have basically sectarian kidnapping between communities in Homs, so what you want to do is de-emphasize the Sunniness or Shianess of this conflict and de-escalate and emphasize inclusiveness and try to reconcile between different groups. What we see actually is the opposite. That was imposed by counting even like fake votes around that time. And also with the vote, you don't know how many people are non-Syrian or based outside Syria or supralocal who invested in that vis-a-vis those who are inside Syria and voted. Like you can't, that doesn't even, like, there's a tricky thing about numbers. When you say 70% of XY voted for that, yeah, you have to ask questions. who are these people? Are these like one person voting multiple times by using different accounts? Is he Syrian, non-Syrian? Is he from diaspora? Or is he based inside Syria? Like there are many variations that, so we don't see these dynamics. What we see is the finished product. Oh, these are the slogans. It was peaceful based on that and that. But this is why it was the crux of contentious politics was unfolding on the ground. The debates that I witnessed some of them, like during meetings with activists, where you have disagreement around how to vote. Why is this? Why they did that? So that's vibration. That really deliberation about politics in this sense is hidden from the finished product. And also, I want to emphasize that early on there were protests like in solidarity with Daraa in areas like Sweda and Salamiyah, and this is from the very first week. But you don't see this amplified in the media. For recently, there were protests in Sweden, and I see some younger generation of activists or anti-regime say, "Oh, now you remember us. Now you are in solidarity." But this generation really don't, because they are dealing with narrative that constructed later on. They don't know that there were actually protests that took place in solidarity with this movement, but there wasn't an investment in their rhetoric and amplification of what they, because they represent the inclusiveness of the movement early on. And also there are variations, local variations. Demand in Banyas had their own local dynamics, and Homs as well, and Idlib, but it's different from the dynamics in Latakia and in Sweda and Salami and there is Zor, where you have tribal affiliation has more significant as well. So we have to take all these variations into consideration and avoid driving generalizability and causality, like 1+2 equal 3, and that's it. That's the only story that we should tell. The question by Kati is also very significant, because this is why I built my project on emphasizing one of the early narrative, which is the regional bipolarization. And I want to remind like scholars and others that after the first protest in Daraa, some actually gave testimony, eyewitnesses, and claimed that Hezbollah actually is cracking down on people in Daraa. This is the first week. And there were chants against Hezbollah and Iran, and there wasn't any direct intervention or even comments by Hezbollah at the time. So this is why historicizing, contextualizing these meanings is very significant. But these eyewitnesses were responding to the big narrative that emerged after the war in Iraq, where you have really proliferation of sectarian identification in the public narrative, and where Iraq became the backyard of the mobilization of identity between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and Lebanon, which has a long history of confessional system that is really made there based on the civil war. So this is why some appeal to this narrative, and even the Syrian regime appealed to this narrative when they claim that the protest is part of the Bush administration new Middle East project to create a new identity in the region. So yeah, we should. I can't emphasize enough that we cannot read the emergence of Syrian discourse in Syria and militarization without actually contextualizing that with the social movement in the Arab world and also the larger context. So the final question was about ISIS. Yeah, that's beyond the scope of this article, but ISIS, when it was the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, before they named themselves as the Islamic State, as basically a local branch in Syria coming from Iraq. So they had some fightings, especially in Aleppo, in coordination with some battalions of the Free Syrian Army. And the attack on Latakia, the one that I showed like in the slides, was sponsored partially by Al-Ajami. So they were a member of this group, one of many groups. And I forgot what his name, the leader of the Free Syrian Army problematically said, like, praised their fighting and they are our brothers in arm. That was during an interview in Orient. So there was a normalization of these groups out of fear, out of pragmatism, but not necessarily out of just sectarian solidarity. Definitely, some group saw ISIS and al-Nusra as defending Muslim Sunni against perceived extermination from Alawite or Shia. This is their representation, their vision. But others actually cooperated with them pragmatically. And we have to distinguish between all these dynamics, because we can't reduce that to single actors. Sometimes actors actually shared multiple narratives. Some actors, for instance, had a narrative for Arab audiences and then another narrative for the liberal-minded West, where everything is about human rights, about inclusiveness, but at the same time, same person would be using like really sectarian narrative in social media and Arabic media. We have many examples. I'm not going to delve into that, but thank you for this question. It's great.
Thank you, Basil, and Ali Al-Jundi, and everyone that asked in one way or another. A couple of at least shared that they appreciate the clarification. Well, we are coming to the end of this talk. I could talk about this for a long time. As you know, I'm writing on Syria constantly, even though I'm not publishing, because this one is a book. So, but I'm not going to go that route. Instead, what I would like you to do, if you have time, to just close with what you'd like us to know about sectarianism in Syria, over and above the particular focus of this presentation. What is it that you would like to impart on people that are confused, and rightly so, by all of the talk about Sunnis and Alawis and Christians, well, mostly Sunnis and Alawis in Syria, but also Shi'is in the region and so on. But in the context of Syria, what should be the takeaway from this for someone who's interested in this topic, but would like some sort of a framework, maybe? How to think about sectarianism going forward if something happens? To what extent do we attribute things to sect, and how does sect interact with other factors, including political orientation, class, political position, and so on?
Yeah, thank you. This is a difficult conclusion, right? But I want to emphasize the takeaway is to question the concepts and terms, at least a question. The easiness with which we use the adjective before even analyzing what we are interested in. So we reach to conclusion before even conducting the research and question our own package, like of what we think of. And a distinction between sectarian identification doesn't refer to one category. It's as many scholars refer to, there is panel sectarian identification, which is really not harmful at all, like practicing your own ritual, religious, like Karbala or going to Hajj, and it doesn't affect anyone. But then instrumentalization, when you use that to ban certain group and commit violation against others and privilege others, that's instrumentalization. And militant sectarian identification, which is the radical stage where actually you could kill someone, kill your neighbor based on their perceived identification. I will emphasize also the great work of Leanne Fuji on her studies about Rwanda, where actually she problematizes many of the similar takeaway about what is about ethnic conflict and ethnicity. And finally, I want to emphasize the nexus between multiple identity. Overemphasizing one dimension of identity doesn't do justice to understanding. Like, we have multiple identity, we have a class, we have education, we have gender, we have all these nexus intermingling with each other, and depending on the conditions, socioeconomic conditions and violence, some of these variations might become more politically salient and others not. But since identity is socially constructed and reimagined, it could be reversed, but it take longer time, especially after bloody conflict like the Syrian conflict. Finally, there is big talk about the silent majority, attributing their attachment to the social order based on attachment to neoliberalism. That's one argument that's great. But also, there is dominant narrative that they were attached to their sectarian identity. I know personally many people who supported the uprising and actually switched back to taking a neutral position after basically having experienced like personal loss, like kidnapping or losing someone. So, how to analyze the position of someone? They retreat to their sectarian identity, or there is something more salient that shaped their perception and meaning. So taking all these categories into consideration, and I want to emphasize really class, because we saw a competition between localities in Syria, and solidarities based on that also played a major role, especially between cities and rural areas. And thank you for this opportunity. Writing this research is an opportunity to learn, to think, and to contribute to many other great works that I have learned from. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. Actually, Basil, this was illuminating. I apologize earlier. There was a small technical issue, so I had to move around while I was listening. But I realized that I would like to watch the recording because there were a lot of nuggets, and I'd love to hear this once more. Also, I'd like to share with everyone that we have a few events coming up. Before I say goodbye to Basil, I'll just quickly share them. Of course, this is the making of Sects, which Basil just delivered today. On Monday, we're having a podcast on titled Search Files, Knowledge Production and Pedagogy on the Middle East, which focuses on decolonization and visual art, with Girish Daswani and Ahmed Barclay, who will be joining me and Mikarim El Jamal to address this topic. On Wednesday, we have Artists Talk, Geographies of the Future, Traveling the Arab Majority World and Virtual Reality, with 8 speakers, including Ala Yunus, Majd Al-Shihabi, Ahmed Barclay again, Boris Dogulussoz, sorry about the butchering of the name, Arij Honiti, Eliza Goldox, Hunty Goldox, and Hunty or Hunty, I am not sure. Ali Yas, Ahmed is Essam al-Din, and it will be moderated by Jessica Holland and Bridget Garachi, as well as myself, who will be, of course, sharing this via both the Middle East and Islamic Studies programs Facebook as well as Jadaliya's Facebook. We also have at the end of the semester, the end of April, a very important event titled Discrimination and Bullying in Middle East and Islamic Studies, cases from GMU, College of the Humanities and the Social Sciences, as well as a case from UNC Chapel Hill History Department. And we will be addressing those matters and the date shortly. We'll be revealing the dates. We also have a potential a couple of other events, including an annual lecture, which I will discuss soon, because we're trying to finalize all the plans so far. So with that, let me thank you, Basil, once again for joining us and illuminating us on this very complex topic, and I know that the work is not ever going to be done, but it's really important to take what you shared with us, the insights you shared with us, to help us think about this topic in a more informed and grounded manner. So shukran again, and we hope to see you soon.
Shukran. Thank you.
Take care.